The Majority Report with Sam Cedar.
It is Tuesday, June 26, 2018. My name is Sam Cedar. This is the 5-time award-winning Majority Report. We are broadcasting live to tape steps from the industrially ravaged Gowanus Canal in the heartland of America, downtown Brooklyn, USA. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it is my son's graduation from pre-K. I mean, it's really not that big of a deal, but it's important to him. So I'm there right now. And in my stead, I am recording this back then. Today on the program, Henry Giroux from McMaster University, author of his most recent American Nightmare, Facing the Challenge of Fascism. This is an interview I did with him just a couple of days ago. And obviously, in light of what we've experienced in this country, I guess it was really only last week. It feels like it was ages ago. The concept of creeping fascism doesn't seem quite so remote as it might have at other times. And so Henry Giroux is someone who's been writing about this type of stuff for ages. Obviously, neoliberalism. I had an interesting talk with him, so you will enjoy that. Just a reminder, you can support this program by going to jointhemajorityreport.com. Pennies a day will keep this program going, and as a way of saying thank you, we give you extra content almost every day. And I say almost every day because today we won't. This is our offering for today, but a good interview. Just want to remind you also that hiring is rather difficult. As you may be aware, Michael has taken a spontaneous vacation. I don't know what that's what you call it. Just sort of where you're just like, hey, I'm going to take a vacation. So there's times like this where you start to think about hiring choices and how hard would it be to hire somebody new. I'm not saying the two are related. It's just when you start to think about vacations and other benefits. What's that?
Like free association?
Yeah, total free association. Generally, you're hiring if you own a small business or even a big business for that matter. I know that you know what I know, which is hiring can very well be a nightmare. But now there's one place you can go where hiring is simple, fast, and smart, a place where growing businesses connect to qualified candidates. That place is ZipRecruiter. ZipRecruiter.com. ZipRecruiter, of course, is what brought Brendan to the show. And when I went through that last hiring process, it was great. Honestly, it was great. I met a lot of great people who I've, tried to hook up with other jobs. Some people who I was hesitant to do that because in the event that I have to jettison someone here, I want them still available, but I'm joking. But no, a lot of great candidates, and I was incredibly impressed. ZipRecruiter sends your job to over 100 of the web's leading job boards, but they don't stop there. They have a powerful matching technology. ZipRecruiter scans thousands of resumes to find people with the right experience, invites them to apply to your job. As applications comes in, ZipRecruiter analyzes each one, spotlights top candidates, so you never miss a great match. It is so effective that 80% of employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate through the site within the first day. That was certainly my experience. I had multiple quality candidates. ZipRecruiter is the highest rated hiring site in America. Right now, my listeners can try ZipRecruiter for free at this address, ZipRecruiter.com/majority. That's ZipRecruiter.com/majority. ZipRecruiter.com/majority. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. All right, now a quick break. When we come back, Henry Giroux. We will be back live tomorrow same time, same channel, etc., etc. We are back. Sam Seder on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program professor at McMaster University, author of many books, and his most recent, American Nightmare, Facing the Challenge of Fascism. Henry Giroux, welcome back to the program.
Sam, it's always a delight to be on the program with you.
Okay, so let's start with some definitions so that we know what we're talking about. Fascism, we hear it quite a bit. What does it mean? Both, I guess, in a sort of a historical context, but my sense is that the term is a lot less. I mean, I feel like sometimes it gets very narrowly defined, and that makes it sort of like historically unique, when in fact it's a dynamic in some ways.
No, right. I mean, I think that in many ways there are two ways to understand this. I mean, one definition is just as you've suggested, enormously static, in that it seems to suggest that it was a period that we can refer to in the 1920s and the 1930s, particularly around places like Italy and Nazi Germany, and eventually even later in Argentina, in some of the countries in Latin America, in which it seems to me that it seemed to include a belief in the supremacy of one national ethnic group over another, and a kind of deep-seated contempt for democracy, and an insistence on an obedience to a powerful leader and a strong demagogic approach. I mean, I think that that's some of the basic elements of a kind of static fascism. But I think that what I've tried to say in this book regarding the use of that term is that it's not static, and that those very elements, whether we're talking about ultranationalism, we're talking about white supremacy, we're talking about a politics of disposability, the notion that a country is in decline, the elevation of emotion over intellectualism, the contempt for dissent, and the rule of law. I mean, these things tend to emerge in different forms. And while one can say, and I certainly have said, that the United States does not mirror in some static way, when I talk about fascism, what we saw in Germany, it does contain elements of a kind of fascism that get reproduced in the American flag and get reproduced in a range of issues that basically are endemic to the culture, the American society and culture, as we're currently seeing it unfolding, especially under the Trump administration.
Are there a set of circumstances? Is there a means in which to measure? Is it when we can say, "Oh, we're living in a fascist society"? Is it something where definitionally we can be?
No, I think that's a great question. I mean, I think there are two ways to answer that question. I think that one is to look at fascism always starts with a language. And it's generally a language of brutality. It's a language of dehumanization. It's a language that legitimates hatred and racism and violence. It attacks the truth. It undermines the possibility of a free press. It refuses to allow the press to hold power accountable, and it often claims that the rule of law can only operate when it serves actually the concentration of power. And I think at one level, when we look at the language of fascism, even in its most brutal forms, one can argue that language has reappeared, particularly under the Trump administration, in a way to provide a very dire warning about where this government is moving. Secondly, I think we look at policies. And I think that what we have seen emerging in the last 40 years in the United States is a kind of casino capitalism that so accentuates both the enormous inequities in wealth and power, massive amounts of inequality, in ways in which 40 million people are living in poverty in the United States, and 12 million people are living in extreme poverty. And I think that what these conditions often do is they generate what I would call fascist instincts. They mobilize certain kinds of fascist principles, the hatred of the other, the blaming of Muslims, the appeal to racial purity, the extreme nationalism. all these things find an avenue in a kind of resentment that's seething among people who feel relatively powerless. And then, of course, you begin to see policies that are addressed to and bait that group, whether we're talking about the separation of children from their parents at the border, whether we're talking about the hatred of Muslims and laws that seem to suggest that, whether we're talking about a constant accentuation on the part of the Trump administration for a law and order regime that basically refuses to deal with questions of law and order in a legitimate way. Remember, there's a kind of thuggery in Trump's language that even police chiefs have attempted to repudiate when he says, when you arrest somebody, don't just push their head down, bang their head into the car.
Right.
My God. I mean, this is a guy who actually has become a kind of classic example of how the mobilizing passions of fascism are really being fed by both his policies and his language.
I mean, that's the thing is that, I mean, it seems like, and I want to sort of walk through some of the elements of your book, but I mean, while we're here, there's, I mean, certainly we can point to, right, Trump's language, like you say, or the specific policy of separating children from their parents. I mean, but in totality, I mean, this is the thing, is like, how do you know that that fascism has taken hold in real time, right?
It's an interesting question, because if you read the historians of fascism, what they often say is that this emergence of fascism in Nazi Germany, and actually in Italy as well, were actually incremental. I mean, people went about their daily lives being indifferent to all of a sudden policies that were both cruel, inhumane, and extremely dangerous in terms of what they were suggesting. And I think that, one can say, well, what's the end point to recognize that you're in a fascist state? Well, the end point would be when you lose any basic freedoms that suggest that a democracy matters. Or the end point might be those basic institutions that make a democracy possible all of a sudden no longer are there. And I think that what we can say, rather than going to that end point and say, well, we're not really a fascist country until we're there, right. I think that what we really have to say is, look, to what degree are we in the abyss? I mean, to what degree are we moving forward in a way that suggests that end point is possible? Look, Sam, when you get a person like Madeleine Albright, I mean, not exactly on the left, right? Writing a book claiming, we're basically becoming a fascist state. When you get the head of the NSA, Michael Hayden, saying that we're moving towards fascism, I mean, when you get all these conservatives who are now saying, hey, look, we've reached a point that's very dangerous here, and we need to be attuned to it by looking at history so that we can begin to understand that what we have seen in the past echoes something that we're seeing in the present that should become a kind of warning, to say the very least, as to where the country is going. It makes no sense to say we're not a fascist country until we have concentration camps. The question that really has to be asked is, what are the conditions that produce those camps? I mean, I think that's the basic issue.
And are there accelerants? I mean, or is it? I mean, is there the more that one? Well, I mean, because look, I mean, by in a vacuum, if I was to look at what's going on with these so-called tent camps for these children who are immigrants, I could say, these are concentration camps. I mean, not every concentration camp was established as a death camp,
right.
during, they were literally to concentrate undesirables so that ultimately, if speaking as a German in late 30s, if we come up with a solution for how we deal with these undesirables, we'll have them conveniently located. Ultimately, there was a final solution in that
right.
instance. So, I mean, it's when you start to see, I wonder if the lack of reaction, or if there is a reaction to when you start to see these early signs where things, it may be fascism, it may not be fascism, if the reactions in any way function as an accelerant or a de-accelerant.
I think there are two kinds of reactions. I mean, I think that there's often a reaction that's fed by demagogues that actually accelerates and intensifies the emergence of a fascist state. And I think that that's one of the things that we're actually seeing with Trump. At another level, of course, there's a progressive populist reaction, and we're also seeing that in some way is beginning to recognize how dangerous the climate has become. You know, whether we're talking about whether we're talking about the DACA situation, whether we're talking about young students coming out of schools protesting mass violence, whether we're talking the Black Lives Matter movement and the assault on police violence, or whether we're talking about the increasing concerns that many groups are mobilizing over concerning the ecological crisis. But I think that the real issue here is at what point do these groups actually come together and begin to recognize that outside of the political silos that they operate in, there's really a larger threat, and that threat is to democracy itself. And I think that what we need to look at is to ask ourselves, what are the institutions and what are the formative cultures that make a democracy possible? You don't have an informed citizenry, you don't have a democracy. And I think that all we have to do is look at the attack on public education, the attack on higher education, the attack on the press, the attack on the rule of law, the increasing attack in many ways on any element of dissent. When a guy like Trump stands up and says, "Boy, I really like the Kim Jong-un because he makes his people stand up," and that's what I want my people to do, stand up. Then he says it's just a joke, but it's not a joke for him. We know what that means. We know that he confuses loyalty with basically any kind of moral and social sense of responsibility, and I think that in that way, there are indicators in terms of what you're talking about. But I'll go back to something that you've talked about. You say tent city. Remember, the United States has as the social state is eliminated, as the welfare state is eliminated, what takes its place is the punishing state. And if you ask me how I can prove that, all you have to do is ask yourself, talk about two things. You have to talk about the increasing number of people who are considered disposable and throwaways in the United States, and you increasingly can look at the accentuation of what I call the criminalization of a whole range of behaviors. It's a criminal act to be poor today. It's a criminal act to be in schools and to all of a sudden violate a dress code. I mean, the prison is increasingly becoming the model for a whole range of institutions, from social services to the schools to the airports. And I think we need to be very attentive to the way in which violence becomes the only organizing principle left to really solve a whole range of social problems. And that is absolutely endemic to the issue of fascism to me.
And so is the idea that these circumstances make us more vulnerable to a Donald Trump, that we're walking around with like a low, immune system essentially, and we can function like that as long as we don't catch this, we don't bump into this virus on some level?
Well, as long as they don't come for us, right? I mean, look, you've got a civic culture that's been eradicated under neoliberalism, under this extreme form of capitalism. We've lost our shared sense of citizenship. A private right is more important than the common good. I mean, we live in a culture of self-absorption. We live in a culture of immediacy, and I guess what I'm getting at, we live in a culture controlled largely by a corporate media. And we have a Republican Party that basically is a bunch of Vichy Republicans. And we don't have a mass uprising against this form of fascism. And I think, as you're suggesting, if I'm reading you carefully enough, that this is dangerous. I mean, this is really dangerous. I mean, how much further will we let this guy go? I mean, separating children from their mothers, sending their parents back to these Latin American countries where there's rampant crime and violence, and the parents don't even know where the children are. I mean, does it get worse than that outside of camps? The images of these young children in these cages? I mean, look, if you want to measure the index of a democracy in any country, look at the way that country treats its children. And by that measure, the United States, it seems to me, is well on the way to a kind of fascism that is as disgusting and revolting as it is dangerous.
Let's talk about the use of language in this era. I mean, Trump has been president for less than 2 years, maybe a year and a half or so, and yet his ability to dominate the media, to dominate almost every single story now in the news, is a function of him in some fashion. We are sitting here just in this, this past week in the wake of the initial reports about this change in policy that happened in April and the implications of that with the children in the in these camps. We have various administration officials. It runs the gamut from denying this is a policy to saying we're doing this because we wanted to intimidate people. Where are we in terms of language, and what has set the table for this?
We're trapped in a language basically dominated by two parties that are basically wedded to a financial elite. And I think that language has nothing to do with democracy and has everything to do with basically the concentration of power in relatively few hands. And believe me, that's not a conspiracy theory. I mean, I think that when 400 families own half of the wealth in the United States, now you have to ask yourself, what's happened to politics? You know, when all of a sudden the political state becomes a corporate state, people benefit from this. I mean, people benefit from these concentrations of power. Do you think that the people who are backing Trump in any way want to endanger the possibility that he's going to pass further policies like his tax cuts that are going to be enormously beneficial to the rich? Absolutely not. I mean, they'll sacrifice the lives of children on the basis of those potential gains. They've already done it with gun laws. They know that guns kill people. They know that. They know that, if you don't have a gun, it's very difficult to shoot somebody from a car or to walk into a school. They know all this. But there are other interests at work here that we rarely make the connections to. And that is when you have a country that's so vastly undemocratic in terms of its concentrations of wealth and power, it's really difficult, it seems to me, to be able to mobilize the kind of language that we need to be able to say, for instance, capitalism and democracy may not be the same thing. They may be at odds with each other at this point in history. We may be evolving into a form of capitalism so ruthless, so overly narcissistic and self-absorbed, so willing to sacrifice human needs to human profits, that maybe it's time to rethink the language of democracy. Maybe it's time to rethink the language of two parties and to begin to talk about a democratic socialist party. Maybe it's time in some way to talk about what social hope means, what social provisions mean, what are the conditions for real agency. And why is it you have one of the richest countries in the world, and of course Philip Alston from the United Nations just did a major study saying we have among the Western nations the worst healthcare system in the world. This is the only country in the world that has not ratified the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights for Children. Can you imagine? The only country in the world, not just the West, the world. I mean, these are interesting issues, but I think that underlying another question that you've raised is we have to stop talking about authoritarianism and totalitarianism simply in terms of economic structures. We have to ask ourselves, what are the formative cultures that make this possible? How is that possible? How do the cultural apparatuses function as teaching machines that shut down and so limit the language and its meaning that people can't make a distinction between the truth and falsifications anymore? I mean, what happened to schools? What happened to higher education? What happened to a media that's like this radio station, that's really willing to ask hard questions? I mean, I watch NBC, CBS, and the major news programs, TV news programs every night. They are so shallow compared to the BBC. I mean, it's like we have one position and we have another. It's a system that trades off false equivalencies. They can't take a position that matters. Even in the face of Trump's white supremacy regarding Charlottesville, they report it as if being objective is a way to somehow get at the truth. I'm sorry. There are some truths that need to be named.
All right. So if it is the case that, we can look to these institutions and these failure of these institutions, whether it's the media, whether it's our education system, in terms of teaching any type of civic literacy, what is done at that point, right? Like, I mean, if we have a situation where We have both parties on some level are compromised. I mean, clearly it is in the best interest of the Democratic Party to be at odds with Donald Trump. The Democratic Party, I don't think, could have turned out and elected a leader who would be separating families at the border. But we also are aware that, Barack Obama had some record years of record deportations and arrests. I mean, so certainly the table was set for some of this. But what then becomes... and maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves, but let's go for it anyways. I mean, what becomes the sort of like the tangible steps forward? I'm aware that the education system has failed in terms of creating a citizenry. I am aware that our the language and the structure of our world now has been taken over by neoliberalism, and it devalues things like the commons and like citizenship over sort of marketing and sort of financial competition. But what do I do at that point with that?
I mean, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, let's look at the landscape and be able to recognize two things. Power isn't only about domination; it's also about resistance. And I think that we are seeing movements all over the country that are basically, I mean, whether we're talking about these women in the red states who are really fighting around the electoral process to put progressives in power, that's a good step. I think there are a lot of people who are operating at the local level to try to address some issues that they find horrendous, whether it be around the question of taxes, the defunding of public schools. So we see all that at the local level, and that's a beginning to, it seems to me, be able to educate people about issues that matter. It's not enough to do like Robert De Niro does, to call Trump a jerk. That doesn't quite work. I mean, I think that what we really need to do is to say, okay, what kind of policies matter here? Do you need health care? How do we talk about that? What does it mean when a president who claims he's a populist passes a tax law that's basically utterly regressive and most of the benefits go to the financial elite? Let's talk about that. I mean, people need to begin to create a narrative that speaks to people's needs in ways in which they can recognize themselves. I mean, we need a new story about what America is. We need a new story about what politics might become. And that's an educative task. And I think that to the degree to which we recognize that education is central to politics, we can begin to take that seriously, whether through alternative media, working with one foot in mainstream media, struggling over schools, and struggling over those cultural apparatuses that basically promote this. I mean, I'm not unoptimistic. I mean, I think the contradictions are so overwhelming right now that people are looking for alternative languages. I mean, I give a talk and 500 people show up if I put the term fascism in the talk. Right. I mean, people are hungry for a language, for social movements, for something they can put their hands on that give them the sense that they don't have to be written out of the script of democracy. I mean, we are certainly seeing that with young people. I mean, young people have finally recognized that they've been so written out of the script that they can't even go to school without actually believing that the police are more important than their teachers.
Right.
Let
me touch on that for a moment, because I want to talk about your concept of the politics of disposability. But let's talk a little bit about young people for a moment. To what extent? I mean, and I don't want to get too reductive here, but to what extent does the size of generations and the sort of the experience of the baby boomers continues to weigh on us? I can't help but think that we had our last election was between two baby boomers. We have a Democratic leadership that is completely dominated by baby boomers, right? Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi. And there's this, and even Bernie Sanders, but we're sort of like floundering around for the next generation of leaders. Yet the generation just one younger than me, these millennials, and perhaps just slightly older, they don't seem to be, their experience has been so different and not defined by the generations before them. And they seem to be the most. Well, it gives me the most hope. Let me put it that way. So, give me your sense of to what extent these generational differences mean anything?
Well, I mean, I think they mean a great deal, certainly in terms of the way culture and society has changed in light of the forces that shape those generations, right? I mean, this generation has grown up under they've grown up under the star of Reagan. This is a generation that has completely grown up under the forces of neoliberalism, under the notion that there's no alternative. As Margaret Thatcher once said, right? Under the notion that government really is more your enemy than your friend. Right. And I think that at the same time they've grown up in a culture in which the question of power, politics, culture, and everyday life has taken on a distinctiveness with a new technology that offers them an opportunity not just to play games, but to actually communicate with each other and use that technology in ways to enlighten themselves, so that they not only have a limited sort of experience of what the world is about, but have access to a broader understanding of that experience. Unlike many theorists, I think that's a good thing. I mean, I think that what we're now seeing with this generation is a generation that's far more cosmopolitan than I think the baby boomers were.
Right.
I mean, the baby boomers were driven by the assumption that, life is open, right? There's a sense of social mobility. You can go to college, you can get a degree, you can buy a house. This generation has grown up under a very different assumption, and that is you're lucky if you're able to survive. You're going to have 15 bosses in your lifetime. It's not about getting ahead. It's about surviving. Democracy is not really working for you, and your life will be much worse than what your parents had. And I think that given those sets of assumptions, this generation is now fighting back and saying, sorry, we're not buying that script. You created that script for us, and it's wrong. And it's at odds with what democracy means. It's at odds with the sense of possibility means. And so we increasingly see a generation that has moved away from a privatized sense of hope to a social sense of hope, meaning that they believe that problems are not just individual, that that all problems can be put at the footsteps of individuals, so as to claim that if there's a problem, you ultimately are the only one responsible for it. They realize that they can translate private issues into systemic problems. That's the great difference with this generation. And it seems to me that's really grounds for hope.
Let's talk about the culture of cruelty in Trump's America. What do you mean by that term?
I mean, the culture of cruelty is a culture that basically disdains human needs and human rights, and has no problem elevating questions of power over questions of human needs. And it's become so expansive within the last 40 years. Because it seems to me that the more that you economize every aspect of social life, the more that you believe that the market basically has the ability to solve all problems and to control not only the economy, but again, the entirety of social life. It becomes a template for all social relations. Morality begins to disappear. Questions of social responsibility begin to disappear. Remember, at the essence of neoliberalism is the notion that economic activity has nothing to do with social cost. And I think to the degree to which we write out questions of ethics, questions of social responsibility, questions of justice, all of a sudden you create a culture that disdains weakness, that refuses compassion, that is more than willing to actually humiliate people who are vulnerable, and is more than willing to take away all those social provisions that would be applied to people in a way that would give them an opportunity to live a decent and just life. All you have to do is look at the language, I mean, that has emerged among these extremists in the last 40 years. People being bums, poor people being stupid, people who exercise any kind of compassion being weak. I mean, the language of the culture of cruelty is the language of reality TV, right? There's only one person left on the island. It's the language of a war of all against all. It's the language of absolutely rigid, stupid, it seems to me, poisonous forms of competition. I mean, it's a language so rooted in self-interest that it's lost the possibility for imagining that any society has to be social and not just an aggregate of self-interested individuals. And that creates a culture that is indifferent to human suffering and lacks compassion, if not disdains it. And the consequences of that are truly deadly and toxic for many people.
Tell me what you mean by the politics of disposability. How is that related to that concept?
Well, I think that when you live in a culture that throws away everything, particularly goods, the politics of disposability in the last 40 years takes on a particular kind of resonance and relevance in that more and more people are now considered disposable. More and more people are now being left out of the American dream. More and more people are now being seen as a threat to a particular kind of notion of racial purity. More and more people all of a sudden are outside the bubble of inclusion on the grounds of a kind of poisonous ultranationalism or a toxic racism. And so what I've argued is that increasingly, whether you're talking about a war on youth, whether you're talking about a war on poor blacks, whether you're talking about a war on brown people, undocumented immigrants, the scope and the level and the degree and the range of disposability of those who are considered excess has so expanded that it's now become a defining feature, I would argue, of American politics.
Let's talk a little bit about this concept of democracy in exile and toward a politics of ungovernability. Discuss those two concepts for me and where that leads us.
What I've argued about the notion of democracy in exile suggests that there are all kinds of institutions and social relations developing throughout the United States in which people keep the idea of democracy alive, whether it's about shared goods, whether it's about trading it off with each other, whether it's about the rise of the sanctuary movement, whether it's about new attempts at thinking what communities actually are. Whether it's about creating health services that are not based on simply profit, whether it's about bringing people together in public spheres in which they produce their own newspapers, they produce their own media. I mean, these are alternative spheres that become a model for what democracy should look like. And I think we're seeing them sprout up, particularly among young people, all over the place. I mean, they're not governed by the logic of greed and rabid individualism and a kind of war of all against all. There are places where people are trying to resurrect a sense of shared citizenship, a sense of public service, a kind of passionate notion of compassion. And I think that unless those things become visible, or let me put it differently, when they do become visible and as they begin to emerge, they offer an antidote to a kind of toxic capitalism that basically believes that there should be no social provisions, there should be no social goods, that the commons doesn't matter, and it's okay to wage war on the planet in ways that would eventually destroy it, and to elevate the question of militarism over the question of justice.
So, I mean, just to sort of to bring this home, the act of resistance. In a practical sense, how does it stem the tide of fascism? I mean, is it something that needs to have depth or breadth or both?
It has to have both. It has to have both. It basically has to be insightful in terms of the forces that are now threatening democracy. And at the same time, it has to expand into social movements, into what I would call a mass political formation capable of challenging these two existing parties. We cannot allow the Democrats to basically be the party of resistance. They are not the party of resistance. They're the party of the financial elite. They're the soft version. The Republicans are the hard version. And it seems to me that not only do we need to have what I would call 1 foot in and 1 foot out when it comes to resistance, meaning that I think all the major institutions that govern American life should be seen as sites of struggle, and we should do everything we can to change them. But at the same time, I think we also have to operate outside of an electoral process that seems to suggest that if you vote, you've somehow maxed out your capacity for being for democratic participation. I mean, we need to learn. We need to remember what Martin Luther King did, what Gandhi did. These are people who believed in direct action. I mean, these are people who stood in the streets, who put their bodies on the line. These are people who said, sorry, we're not going to wait for an election to be able to liberate young children who are being ripped from their mother's arms and put in basically what appear to be concentration camps. I mean, it doesn't work that way. And I think that in many ways, people have been too comfortable with the notion of democracy that they think works well, when in fact it's been consistently eroded, in full view.
So, I mean, to be clear, you're not saying. I mean, you're saying participate in elections and make choices that are somewhat expedient there, but do not do that at the expense or as some type of substitute for far greater involvement in direct action. And
no, absolutely, Sam. Sam, what I'm saying is, unlike many people, I'm not saying it's reform or a radical restructuring of society. I'm saying it's both. I'm saying reforms are limited, but in the most immediate sense, they may save people's lives, right? I mean, I'm sorry. If I have the opportunity to change power relations, which make sure that people are not making a choice between eating and taking their drugs, I'm going to make it. I don't believe in that kind of political purity where you say, no, that's reformism. I'm sorry. That's nonsense to me. I mean, I think that we need to do everything we can to eliminate the suffering that people are engaged in. At the same time, we need to change systemically the structure that produces it. And reforms will not do that.
I see. It's a little bit of walking and chewing gum at the same time, I guess.
No, it's a matter of being able to think in dialectical terms, to put it that way. I mean, right? I mean, it's a matter of knowing what you can do in the most immediate sense, but also recognizing in the long term, it's a long march through the institutions. These institutions have to change. And especially with the war on the planet. I mean, I don't know how much time we have.
Right.
The clock is ticking. That atomic clock is now what? 1 minute before doomsday or 30 seconds? I mean, people have to wake up. You have to wake up and realize that these are dangerous times. These are crucial times. Resistance is no longer an option. It's an absolute necessity.
Henry Giroux, the book is American Nightmare, Facing the Challenge of Fascism. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
You bet, Sam. Thanks for having me on.
It might take all the strength I got to get to where I want, but I know somehow I'm gonna get there. I wasn't looking when I just got caught between the truth and the light bulb. But finding out won't make me feel any better. Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my pilot light shining bright. I get somewhere the choice was made, for the option where you don't get paid, for the road that bends before it finally breaks you. I guess somehow I lost my drive between the 101 and the 5. Do you know how far the detour takes you? Yeah, I know the clock is ticking, but the meds are gonna kick in, and my